Why didn't Airservices more effectively manage ICC PM's engagements to ensure that the One Sky tender process was free of concerns over perceptions of conflict of interest?
Could you just repeat the question?
Why didn't Airservices more effectively manage the engagements of ICC PM to ensure that the tender process was free of concerns over perceptions of conflict of interest?
We acknowledge that our management of it was not as well as it should be, particularly around the perceived potential conflicts. There were certain assumptions made that just having individuals sign off conflict of interest registers and probity aspects was done, and some of those things were done early in the piece but weren't updated subsequently. There was also an assumption that made that in setting up the strategic partnership, and part of one of the criteria of that strategic partnership were the conflict of interest aspects were to be addressed, and then there was a non-compliance with some of those procedures.
I think we're at two understandings about what we're talking about. I'm not talking about actual conflict of interest. Yeah. I'm talking about perceptions of conflict of interest. Do you accept, for example, that Airservices had a closed mind with respect to its engagement or its strategic partnership with ICC PM?
Yes, I do.
Right. Why was Airservices' approach to administering declared conflicts and monitoring ICC PM's contractors' compliance with the probity plan inconsistent and passive?
In a sense, it's that it goes back to a point that I made, is that the process was put in place, so therefore there's an expectation that it just gets followed, and instead of actively managing things, it is actually, people say there's a process in place so therefore it's all done, rather than when you put a process in place you've actually got to actively manage it to make sure that you're achieving the outcomes. And this goes back to that cultural element that we talked about that need to be addressed, and I can apply some of those pieces, reference the conflict of interest and that passiveness, to a range of other processes that we actually have within the organisation, and is actually one of the fundamental drivers of why we're going through a transformation program of actually creating an accountable performance culture in the organisation.
All right, well, on that issue, your response indicates that under the heading of monitoring, that you've put in place steps for improved monitoring and oversight by the executive and board in relation to project delivery and governance.
Yep.
Insofar as that applies to the issue of probity management, what, if any, oversight was there by the executive and the board with respect to probity and conflict of interest?
The board and executive approved the probity management framework and the conflict of interest framework and system and procedures, and it was by exception for things to be elevated within that framework. That was found to be it should have been not by exception. There should have been much more active management, and that's some of the corrections that we've made as a result. We admit that it wasn't appropriate, and the reporting out of it to board level in particular was not adequate.
Right, but I think the point was that you had a range of frameworks available to you, particularly with respect to procurement, and you didn't follow them.
That's correct.
And would that be correct with respect to probity management?
The probity management was managed. What occurred was some of the follow-ups and closing out, I'll call it loose ends, and review. So there were elements of non-compliance or not following, but generally speaking, it was appropriate.
Well, can I put to you that your response, in particular from the organisation, was directed primarily towards the existence of actual conflicts rather than the question of perception. Is that correct?
That would be, that's a fair assumption.
That's a pretty serious failure, isn't it?
In hindsight, yes, it was.
Because the response was signed by the chair.
So the response to the audit.
The response to the audit is very defensive, saying, well, there's no actual conflict, almost implying that perceived conflicts don't matter, and that was signed by the chair.
No, that is correct, but also that we've been on the public record on a number of things, even into Hansard, of acknowledging that our management of perceived potential conflicts of interest was not appropriate. We've even actually put that in there, part of our response, that we've acknowledged that, and they are areas that we've taken action on to improve going forward. We actually have acknowledged that we did not manage them appropriately.
But that failure goes right up to the mind of the organisation, that is the governance of the organisation.
It goes to the focus of the probity framework, and the conflict of interest was very much around the actual, and the considerations around potential were not given the due respect that they should have.
Right.
One more.
In response, how you've indicated that there have been some further steps put in place. How many investigations have been undertaken by the probity advisor and the auditor panel separately, and have there been any significant findings made, and what has changed as a consequence?
So I think in response to this A&AO audit, we've I guess explained some of the pieces of changes to policy procedure and activities that we've put in place. We have the probity advisor sitting alongside, reviewing some of those elements, and as Mr Harfield mentioned earlier, we've then had a probity auditor run a probity audit over recent months, and the report is due next week out of that process.
Right, thank you.
Colleagues, we've got to wind up shortly. Ms Brodman, do you have any more questions?
Just one more.
Okay, one more, and then Mr Hill, and then
Thanks, Chair.
Ms King, and then that'll be it.
Just Airservices. You mentioned the fact that it was a cultural issue largely in the organisation. The fact that essentially the organisation felt that they could operate outside the norms, the Commonwealth guideline norms. I'm particularly concerned about the fact that they felt that they could operate outside the 80,000 threshold, which is an international agreement threshold. But aside from that, would it assist in implementing cultural change in the organisation if you were brought under the PGPA Act?
We are currently under the PGPA Act.
Are you?
We are. It's the Commonwealth procurement rules that don't directly apply.
Okay, and so, well, would it assist bringing about that cultural change act if
In effect,
if there was some sort of mandating of those rules to apply to you?
In effect, we've cut and pasted almost all of the procurement rules into the policy and procedure, particularly where there was differences. I think the only piece that we would need to look at and understand is where government policy positions, for example, on maybe small, medium enterprises or otherwise, in terms of the percentage of procurements going to those types of entities, whether some of those peripheral issues around the core part of the procurement rules, how they might apply to our organisation and what the impact might be, would need to be considered. Okay. But the core part of it, in terms of competitive processes, the policy and procedure, we've cut and pasted most of the principles and processes back in. Okay, so I suppose my question is, would it assist in the cultural change if it wasn't optional, if it was compulsory for you to comply? I think, as Mr Harfield said, our cultural issue wasn't specifically around procurement. It's about driving an accountable culture more broadly, and we've embarked on what we've called an Accelerate program over the last 6 or 8 months that has transformed the organisation in a structural sense that's driving accountability right from the top down.